today we're going to talk about the first versus the second rut, what that means, where you should be, when, and why. So the first thing that we're going to talk about that a lot of folks don't understand is the difference between the first and the second rut. So the first topic that we're going to touch on today is the time period between the first and the second rut. So depending on where you're at in the country, this can vary. Here in the Northeast and the Midwest, obviously our peak of the rut. Here in Michigan, we always use that, that 15th, that 13th to 15th date for the peak of the rut. Obviously, your rutting activity is probably, 7 to 10 days before that, as far as the influx of the movement of the rut. But the peak of the rut is crucial when we're talking about this 28-day time period. What does that 28 days mean? Earlier around the country, obviously that date changes. Let's start there. So the where you're at in the country will determine how to get to that 28-day time period to justify what makes that second rut so powerful, when it happens, and what it is. Here, like I said, here in the Northeast or the Midwest, that if you were to advance like on the 7th is this year. It does affect changes a little bit because of the weather. It doesn't take into consideration the moon phases, anything like that, because obviously, like we talked in the past, the moon phases and all that disbelief that you hear, as far as a lot of promoting that people are doing it to try to make a dollar here and there, that does not affect the peak of the rut no matter which state you're in. So whether you believe that or not, that's my belief, and that's what I teach and I preach, because I feel wholeheartedly that that's the truth. So we're going to talk about how you determine that day here in just a second. But if you understand where the first rut starts and what the first rut means in your area, if you're down in the south, obviously you're going to be, the further you go south in the country, you are going to be just, take that time period and place it to where you're at. If you're going to be in the Midwest, then maybe that obviously is going to be a week, possibly two behind. If you're in the South or the deep South, maybe you're a month behind that time period. So wherever the rut pertains, that's why I don't have a specific date tied to the first rut. So this pertains to everybody watching. I've got some folks in the deep South down in South Carolina watching. I've got guys as far east as Delaware. I've got a couple folks that have reached out in Colorado and Kansas. So that's why I don't have a specific date tied to this, because I want this to kind of generate to everybody as far as understanding the difference and what that means going forward here into the second rut. So you want to find out, how do you find out that most productive day that you had during the first part of the rut? What I like to do is I like to resource back to my cameras, and I like to take the aid of that camera and make sure that trail camera and so you take your trail camera and you take your experiences or your sightings on stand this fall, and you start taking those and you go back now on your field notes. This year, mine, for example, was my most productive day was November 11th. So November 11th this year is when I start this transition into knowing when exactly that second rut is, and when I need to be there and what I need to be doing at that time period. So I'm going to take the 11th and I'm going to advance 28 days onto that. So my 28 days is going to be around the about the 8th, 9th, 10th window is where I'm focusing my attention on some of the properties that I have, that we're hunting this year. So I always like to resource that. I'm not going to tell you a specific day, whether if you're in Michigan, it's exactly this day or not. It pertains because of pressure. It pertains to some weather that we had, different this year than last year. So that's how I get to that, knowing when the second rut is going. What I need to be doing for that second rut. Advancing that 28 days. What is 28 days? 28 days is the heat cycle of a whitetail doe, whether it's mature or whether it's not. Once they start their heat cycles, it's always 28 days. So if a doe comes into heat and she doesn't get bred, 28 days later, she comes into heat again. So, and we'll touch on something real quick there. There's something that folks need to understand is a heat cycle in a lot of animals across the board is a heat cycle, and humans included, is a heat cycle that always happens every set time period. In the whitetail deer, it's 28 days. So you take 28 days and you advance that every 28 days. If that female isn't bred, 28 days out, she returns in heat. So there's a lot of power to be said about why a rut doesn't happen all the way through the year. So you have to connect this whole scheme that we're going to talk about here. You have to connect this to your deer numbers. If your deer numbers are lower in your area, let's say your doe numbers are lower, then you're not going to experience the rut as much as you're going to experience the rut in a area where your doe numbers are higher, and or your buck numbers are out of whack as far as high and low. If your buck numbers are really low, what you're going to find is you're not going to have that chase effect. You're not going to experience that. That's what is so crucial about knowing your area and what your habitat and your farm and your area in general can hold, as far as what you need going into the entire year. As far as your herd, the balance of your herd can affect the rut, can affect the performance of your rut, and can also affect the outcome of the rut. Now, if you're hunting one county, you're hunting 2 counties over, you're hunting this state, you're hunting that state, that's all going to change. That's the best way that I have found in the past to really be productive in my hunting areas. If you find that most productive day, this year mine was the 11th, you advance it 28 days to take advantage of those does that may have not got bred, and also some other things that we're going to talk about here. But the mature does that haven't got bred, that didn't get bred, whether they weren't in that heat cycle, their heat cycle wasn't as strong, and or the upcoming does that are going to be in heat the first time, and that is your young doe fawns. Your buck fawns have got kicked out from their mother, they're out on their own. Your doe fawns are the ones that are going to be coming into heat when they hit that 70 to 80 pound mark of herd health, body health. They are going to come into their first heat cycle. So that is something that we're going to talk about here on, like I've said in past videos, about being so productive, because the yearling does need to be your focus. Your yearling does are the first on their feet. Your fawns are the first on their feet. Them are the first ones that run out into the food plot. So that's what can make your hunt in the second rut so powerful if you're in the right spot. So we've touched on 28 days. Now we know the difference between the first and the second rut as far as days and when that happens. And let's talk about why and where you need to be. Stand placement is the first thing that we're going to chat about here. So early in the year, if you follow along with any of my videos, I'm a huge promoter of obviously not hunting on your destination feed locations, and I'm also a huge promoter of not hunting internal of your bedding areas, even in the peak of the rut or go time. I don't like putting that pressure on the food sources, and I do not like putting the pressure in that bedding area. I had recently a couple of different folks call in, and we started talking about bedding areas and what's going on internal of their bedding areas and how they knew that. And they started talking about having trail cameras inside of their bedding areas, and to me that's a huge, trail cameras inside their bedding areas, and to me that's a huge no-no. It's a great way to inventory things, but you have to be able to collect that. Now, if it's a cell cam that you never have to go in there and you're 100% sure your batteries aren't going to run out, that might be a kind of a cool way of inventorying it and getting some ideas on how they're operating in your hinge cuts and stuff like that. But if it's a standard SD card, do not do that, especially in a high pressure state. But back to the drawing board here. What you'll see me doing is you see me explaining always not to be on the destination feed locations, and also not being on the in the bedding areas. So we have those transition area stands locations that we side access in from the side. I've got a diagram here. We're just using this on a north wind or northwest wind blowing in, and like I said, we're accessing on the east side of the farm. Early season, we're going to be on those trails, between your doe bedding and your buck bedding, and not putting pressure on there, and then just picking away as the conditions, the weather is right and your wind is right. As the year progresses, we are able to, what is kind of labeled in the industry as crashing in. We are able to put more pressure on the backside of the doe bedding areas, where you could have some bucks Bucks are going to be cruising around the doe bedding areas, scent checking those doe bedding areas, and that's when you start, your stand placements are outside of it or a little bit more internal of those areas where you're normally not, you're not putting that pressure earlier season. Then we go in and we start putting more pressure on those, and why is because we can get in tighter to those bedding areas. The bucks are frequenting, they're returning to their buck bedding areas later in the day. They're on their feet. The end of October, they're cruising. So that all plays into the first rut and why we need to crash in on these areas. Now, stand placement going into the second rut, we do not. That's what differs from the first rut. I highly do not recommend the same stand placements that you have in the first rut. Your stand placements are nowhere near what they are in the for the second rut. So they're nowhere near the first or the second. Two totally different stand placements. And why is that? And the reason is, guys, is a buck. There's a couple things here going down the list here. We're gonna have 3 topics that we're gonna touch on today. And we're going to talk about the thought process, maybe the mentality of a buck. So that all ties into this. But they resort back to food, and the number of does that are left in this 28-day heat cycle that haven't got bred or are going to be coming into heat are drastically less than what they were during the first rut. 75 to 80% of your does are going to be bred, or your females in general, but your does are going to be bred in that first rut. So that leaves a very small window, that 20, 25, 30% that is going to be available. And if you're in an area where those doe numbers just aren't correct, you may not experience that second rut very strong at all, if any. Where are you at with your stand placements during the second rut? Still transitioning in from the side on side access, but we're going back in to these stands near or exactly back into where we were. So whether you leave your early season stands there, or if you're on an area, maybe it's a lease where you don't have those multiple stands, and let's say you have 2 stands to your name and you have to use them, that's fine. But transition these stands back to these areas. So you have tree stand, trail camera, and then the scrapes. And like these black dots here all reference scrapes, obviously, and you can see that wherever I transition these stands to, they always have the mock scrapes that are following them. The vertical licking branches go with them. So what I do is sometimes what I'll do is if you're coming back to this and that promotes that line of travel, then obviously keep those licking branches in there. Now if you totally have to change from the early season to the rut, you totally have to change your path, and you want to keep that line of travel promoted. And by leaving this in there and you're not going to be able to hunt it because of the time of the year, then I will discontinue those licking branches. You can leave them suspended if they're on a rope, throw them up in the tree. You can take them down, you can store them, whatever the case is, and then put them back in. On private pieces that are correct, you don't have to do that because that line of travel is still promoted, so you're not taking that stopping point out of the game. It's just you're coming back to those points of impact. So you want to resort back to these tree stand locations the mentality that you had in early season that is based on that food to bed feed pattern. And this is the final point that we're going to talk about now. When you're in the early season and you can start focusing on these travel patterns, these travel transition areas between food and buck bedding, a lot of the times you can be very successful on obviously what the trails that you found in the post rut or the post season when you're scouting, and then you know where to hang your stands. If you're going to start hanging stands in September, let's say, going into the first week of hunting season in October, you know where you're going to be hanging those stands. Or if you haven't and you're going in there in October and you're going to be hanging stands for that first week of season, obviously the dead giveaway is a well-used trail, right? And that is where you want to resource this back. Now, if it's going to be a rut stand, obviously you have to take contour, you have to take ease of exit and entrance, you have to take areas where the bucks aren't on the trails, they're away from the trails, they're scent checking areas. I'm going to say that 75% of the deer that I have harvested, that I have put clients on, mature whitetail bucks, aren't killed on the trail that I would call the doe trail or the well-traveled trail by the rest of the herd. They're off from it depending on which way the wind, so they're scent checking those areas. And time again, I see guys getting themselves in trouble, hunters getting themselves in trouble by setting a stand 25 yards off a trail and expecting that buck to be that herd mentality and follow the rest of the herd through that trail when he's transitioning on that doe. And what he is he comes in 30 yards behind that because he's scent checking it. Next thing you know, he's at the base of the tree. He's 5, 10, 15 yards behind you, and you get winded, that whole deal. So you have to, and that's other videos and that's other training. And that's other know-how, but you have to understand how to read the contour during the rut when you're hanging rut stands. But that focus all goes back to going back to an early season mentality and changing that tree stand program back into these center locations more between the between your food and your buck bedding or your bedding in general. But when I say bedding, I always resort to and I know this changes out on public ground where you can't pinpoint exactly because of pressure, because of the food sources isn't as strong as it is on private ground, let's say. But if we're talking about private ground and you know that you have promoted your doe bedding area as close as you can to that food source, that food plot, and you know that doe bedding is there, then you can comfortably place yourself between buck bedding and your doe bedding, and you need to get back in between. Why is that? Is because it takes the pressure out of your doe beds. It lets them start recouping from the pressure from the entire year. And you're able to let those bucks, if they want to be as non-social as they are during the rest of the year, and they want to go back to their buck bedding areas, then they can, and then they'll transition from there all the way back. What I find is a lot of these buck bed areas will start creeping up during the late season, the second rut, in the late season, depending on weather, the colder it is. All these deer start bedding closer together. You'll start seeing today. We actually pulled a card and we've got a bunch of immature bucks back together on trail camera. In the same video, we've got 2 or 3 bucks together, and it's just a matter of time before like last year we had 2 or 3 mature bucks all in one trail camera picture when it went off. The middle, I think it was the second week of December. So that's why, is because you won't get that during the rut because the bucks are off on their own. They've got their own does. They're separate. They don't want to be around each other. This time of the year, this whole section starts shrinking back down towards that feed, and you just have to be willing and you have to be able to give them their space again. You have to be able to go back to your early season patterns, get back in those early season stand locations, focus on the aid of your scrapes, and put that attention back in the center, take that pressure off the rest of it. That's the difference in stand placement from the first to the second rut.